Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with Michael Huerter. Michael is a pastor at Holmeswood Baptist Church in Kansas City, where he leads worship and works to build community and connection. As a lifelong church musician and digital native, he is interested in engaging with and contributing to scholarship that bridges the gap between research and practical ministry. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Hello and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr., and today I'm pleased to be welcoming Dr. Michael Huerter to the show. Hello, and thanks for being here.
So glad to be here. Thanks for having me on the show, Loren.
Yeah, looking forward to this conversation today. Let's begin. Anything else you wanted our listeners to know about you?
Sure. I really enjoy cooking, especially pasta. I love Italian food. I like running and hiking. I also enjoy video games and tabletop games. One thing you have to know about me is that I love dogs very much. I'm a big dog person.
Okay, well, my dogs will, one of them at least shove her face into my lap at least one time during this conversation.
Well, I want every dog to be my friend, so that'd be fine with me.
Good. Share, if you would, kind of about your faith background, what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian household and being involved in church and church worship and music kind of from a very young age. But I would say, looking back now, different seasons of my faith journey have had different emphases. So like, for instance, when I was in high school and college, I think my faith was very emotive. It was a lot about my relational connection with God and how I felt about that. When I was in seminary and then in doctoral studies, I was diving more deeply into the life of the mind and loving God through theology and learning and asking lots of questions. And since leaving academia and working in full-time congregational ministry, I would say my faith has more emphasized the practical. How do I embody my beliefs in loving my community and caring for others? What are the relationships that are most important to me, and how do I encounter God through those people? So the heart or the emotions, the mind, and the practical living out of faith are all important, but I think I've experienced more growth in each of those areas at different stages, and I'm grateful for each of those. And a lot of those have changed. I mean, my emotional landscape around faith is very different than it was a decade ago, and some of my theology has shifted over the years, but those are still important to me too. But kind of that's the broad timeline I would sketch out of how I've grown and experienced faith at different stages of my life.
Yeah, awesome. Share, if you would, any kind of spiritual practices that are meaningful for you that you're willing to share.
Yeah, I think two spiritual practices that I find meaningful in this season of my life are spending time in nature and reading and writing poetry. I've already named how faith is, for me, has come to be more about relationships with others, but I also still value solitude. So over the past year, I felt more drawn to appreciating God as creator, being out in nature to experience God's goodness and the gift of life through those things. So I find when life feels chaotic, being in kind of the untamed natural world is kind of grounding for me and very peaceful and helpful in that way. And that often also kind of inspires me to write reflections or poems, kind of processing and expressing what I'm thinking about, how I'm encountering God, what my prayer life is like. So alongside scripture, I think of poets like Rilke or Mary Oliver or Jan Richardson, and those people often and others often articulate things that feel meaningful to me for faith. And then I also really appreciate I do think of it as a spiritual practice of writing those reflections and poems to kind of put on the page what are the the thoughts and feelings and wonderments that are rumbling in me, and then they become more clarified as I'm able to kind of put those down on paper. So I think those are some helpful practices for me these days.
I'm always so envious of you folks who have the poetic gift. I've always struggled. I could never really do poetry well. And then one of my colleagues in CPE, like, I don't know if you did CPE or certified pastoral education.
I haven't.
In a hospital setting, like one of the colleagues of mine, like she could just spit it out like she wasn't even trying, like an amazing poem, and she's like, hey, it just comes out of me. I'm like, it's amazing, that gift, folks that have it. Let's move on to talk about Michael is the author of the book, The Hybrid Congregation, A Practical Theology of Worship for an Online Era. And I was saying this, Michael, to you offline, and I kind of want to start the conversation here. Like, your book is far more than like a practical how to do online worship better. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, kind of like, what shaped your approach to this book, and what do you hope to accomplish, or what did you hope to accomplish really with it?
Yeah, I became interested in kind of the intersection of church and online technologies a little bit before COVID hit. So I had been exploring those things, digital mediatization, how digital technologies were important in our culture, kind of back before 2020 in my seminary days. But in January of 2020, I started working part-time at a church doing music ministry. And at the same time, I was applying for my doctoral program in church music. So my interview for that program had to be held over Zoom early in the COVID shutdown. And I was already describing this interest in the intersection of the internet and church and worship, and how those things could work together, what we needed to think about for them. So I was having this, process of entering into doctoral studies. And at the same time, the church I was working at was trying to figure out what to do when we were in the COVID shutdown. Initially, this just looked like Sunday's coming. We've got to do something. Let's put a camera up in front in an empty sanctuary and send something out to our people. And that's where we started. But I kind of had this front row seat to church trying to make sense of what to do in this new landscape, while also taking courses and doing research around the history and the practice and theology of church music. So I think the combination of those two experiences led to this book, which came out of my dissertation. So, I mean, you mentioned that idea of it's not just about how to do worship better. For me, the question is not so much like, is a video feed of a sanctuary on a Sunday the future for the church? I tend to think that it's not, but I do think that many churches will continue to have some version of that. My church does that, and I think there are some benefits. But I'm concerned about kind of the deeper questions that I think will inform what the church becomes over the coming decades and centuries. So it was kind of important for me to try to put our current moment in some historical context. So I would argue that in the 21st century, we are in the early stages of a technological revolution with the advent of the internet and social media. So I would compare this to the invention of the printing press. So this was a new communication technology that transformed the world, including how information was shared, how economies functioned, how church and government power worked, and how people believed and practiced their faith and shared those beliefs. The Protestant Reformation was a huge upheaval for the church, and it happened in large part because of this new technology of the printing press. We've seen also similar things happen, maybe to a lesser degree, with other technologies like the radio and the television. Each one of those is kind of disruptive to the established church and the norms that we have. It raises questions about the church, about our worship, and these questions can take, decades. In the case of the printing press, I would say centuries to be worked out. So I would say that we're in kind of the middle or the beginning of another shift like that. So what I think this means is that neither I nor anyone else can necessarily conclusively say that we know what's going to happen in the next few decades of the church. So this book isn't really trying to do that. Instead, my goal was to contribute to the conversation that will need to be ongoing both in the academy and in the church about kind of how we move forward while the ground continues to shift under our feet. So that's kind of the goal, is to contribute to conversation, provide ways of thinking and information to consider for academics, for scholars, and for pastors and ministers as we're kind of working through together, what does the church look like going forward? What do we need to do? What do we need to consider? So that was kind of the goal of the book.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciate, even in your answers, hearing you, is I think it does offer a unique setting for you to have a tie to the local church. I think too often academia can be disconnected from what happens on the ground, and I think it adds value to your book and then to your thoughts writ large to have that connection. So I think that's an important point too that I want to emphasize. I'm trying to think about, how to take this conversation, because like you just shared so much there, you have so much in the book. So I think I'm gonna go backwards from what I was thinking about, because at the end of the book on page 151, you talk about the burden of participation.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking about like what you said, how we're very much, what you said, in the early middle, the middle early of kind of navigating this whole disruption or change or new thing. Like we're still wrestling with like what it means to be, I mean, you have some of these conversations in the book, certainly, but like what it means to be in worship. So I don't know. It's kind of a wide open question, but feel free to respond to like, what do we do with, like, what does even participation mean anymore, I suppose?
Yeah, it is a big question. I think one way that I think we can take that, when I think about worship in the church and kind of our traditional, not in terms of style, but just the form and way of gathering in a sanctuary and worshiping together, I think that certainly has deep value and is rooted in our tradition, and I think that will continue. And I also wonder what other kinds of forms the church may take going forward. So when I think about participation, that burden of participation is kind of an idea that I was wrestling with. Well, to take a step back, I think a lot of the things that kind of motivated me to write this book were as I was in that early 2020 time when there were these conversations developing around what church was and how we would do things online and what to do about COVID and all these things. Right. Part of what led to the structure of the book and the questions I was answering, and well, not answering, but exploring, trying to find some useful insights for, were around things that I saw that kept coming up in these kind of early conversations around online worship and the form the church would take. And one of those was this idea that, well, online worship is just purely passive. It's consumeristic. There's no real participation and engagement there. And that didn't ring fully true to me, in part because I think there are opportunities for meaningful engagement and formation and relationship building that uses various technologies. But also that I don't think it's a given that deep participation and active engagement always happens in a church sanctuary. And also, I'm not sure that our faith has to be constantly active all the time. I think there's an interplay of the active and the passive that are all, that's all woven in there, and that's a part of how we relate to God. And that can be a good thing. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think that idea of the burden of participation for me was one of those ways of thinking through. I think COVID and the shift to include more online expressions of church gives us an opportunity to re-examine and question and look at what are the ways that we've done things that we just do them because they're the way we've always done them. And what are the pros of those things? What are the drawbacks? Are there blind spots that we have had that were maybe brought to light by this kind of upheaval brought about by COVID?
Yeah. I'm glad you kind of hint at this term interpassivity, and I'd not been familiar with the term, so I'm going to pull up a couple quotes from your book where you talk about on 53 the monstrous duty experienced entirely by the individual. And then you talk about how this idea of interpassivity can refer to the delegation of enjoyment or consumption. It can also refer to the delegation or sharing of belief. So this comes to mind, and tell me if I'm off track here, but tell me if I'm hinting at what you're getting at. In an episode I just released where we talked about, my guests and I talked about, from my tradition, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ is a non-creedal tradition. We famously say we have no creed but Christ. And the clergy group, and in this conversation, we questioned like whether or not, like whether we need something to be more bonding, for lack of a better word. And my co-host who was leading the conversation, Martha Tatarnik, who's Anglican, talked about how she can appreciate, like in Anglican or Episcopal spaces, how that creed, saying the creed, even when you don't entirely may not believe it in the moment, offers us some sort of, again, if I'm getting at it right, delegation of the sharing of belief. So
yes.
Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that would be one expression of that. Something like a creed would be that is recited together as a gathered worshiping body would be an expression of kind of that interpassivity of the delegation of belief. When I am not able to fully believe, others are there to believe for me and to carry our faith together. I think that can show up in other ways as well. I think corporate song is one of the ways we do that. I mean, you can have two people in a gathered congregation on the same Sunday. One may be grieving and struggling, and that may lead them into a very close sense of trust and faith in God, or it could lead to a lot of doubt. And in either one of those cases, there could be someone else who is, grateful and feeling blessed and so happy to be there. And both of those experiences belong in worship. And if we see one person who is not, singing and jumping up and down and raising their hands, that doesn't mean that they are not expressing their faith and experiencing relationship with God. And there is a sense in which we can sing and express our faith on behalf of each other. And so part of this idea of the monstrous duty, it's a phrase that Carolyn Mackey uses to describe kind of an experience of faith that feels like a pressure to experience or express a depth of emotion that we may be humanly incapable of, at least all the time. So as an analogy, you might think about going on a vacation, but you're so worried about, this is my vacation, I'm supposed to have fun, I'm supposed to relax, that you're too worked up about being relaxed that you're not relaxing at all, and you ruin the vacation because of it. I think sometimes we do the same thing with faith, where we put this pressure on ourselves that I need to, have this mountaintop experience of God and worship, otherwise is this even worship? Where I think we can think of worship as a more communally shared kind of formative practice over time that, yes, includes these moments of transcendence and also includes these very mundane and human experiences of just being together and holding and carrying each other when faith is difficult.
I think the thing, and hopefully this is what I'm remembering from your book, the thing that I think was really powerful and helped put it into relevance for me was, do you reference like the Passion concert or some kind of like big evangelical non-denominational kind of worship concert, which might be, for my mainline friends here, like try to imagine, this is not necessarily our scene, so to speak, but like, certainly
it's not mine either, to be honest, but like, interesting.
Like we've seen those kind of things, like, and like they look so incredible, but I think as you point out in the book, like there is this kind of like individual pressure to feel like we're just like, if you're a participant, you're always just basking in worship, and you point out like sometimes you're just like emotionally and physically exhausted, and then ends up feeling this guilt, and that's like you're saying, right? That's the monstrous duty. Am I hearing you right? Having to always be in overflow.
Yeah. And that's kind of an example that I gave as kind of the extreme of worship needs to be active all the time. And I'm just kind of pulling this back to say it doesn't need to be all active or all passive. There is an ebb and flow of this in our lives and our faith. And I think that's well and good for our worship as well.
So let's talk about a little bit about corporate versus individual worship. I mean, I'm certainly a big believer in the gathered community and the emphasis or the benefits of that. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of David Taylor, who's written on A Body of Praise. I had him on, it's been a while, but talked about the benefits of on corporate worship on a human body. Certainly, like I would hope, like most Christians would affirm the importance of the gathered community. That being said, we also, broadly speaking, in Christianity, talk about the importance of individualizing our faith. Like, how do you balance those? Because certainly we want to hold both things to be true, but we can certainly, I think, lean toward one, emphasizing one or the other. How do you balance those or find those that creative tension?
Yeah, I think hearing that question, my initial instinct is to kind of speak on that importance of corporate worship and community belonging and shared formation in faith, like you're describing with David Taylor's work, but also as we live in an individualistic and consumeristic society, we don't want our worship to be an extension of that. At the same time, I do believe, as you mentioned, in the importance of God's love for each person, and that God's love is accessible to individuals even when communities or institutions fail us. So I think it's important for us to engage in communal practices and rituals for our faith formation and for our well-being. Thinking about kind of the age of the internet related to this as well, there's also interesting research by Heidi Campbell and other scholars of digital religion about how religion in the age of the internet has become kind of a buffet of picking and choosing various practices from different traditions to fit the individual. And I'm not here to say that's entirely wrong, but it's an interesting shift that I think we're seeing. I also think that when corporate worship and individuality are raised in conversations around online church and technology, often I think this comes along with an assumption that people who use these new technologies are, automatically being more individualistic, and people who don't use those technologies are being more communal. But I'm not sure I totally fall there either, because I think that would miss the ways that people are using these technologies to build connections and community today. So I think, these in-person relationships and rituals are important to all of us. I also see more and more people finding community and building connections online and using technologies. And then, most of those, I think, can spill over into, in-person expressions and relationships as well. But I think more and more of those are going to start with an initial connection through technology and then kind of bleed over from there.
Yeah, this is such a great point that I want to read this quote here just to highlight your work here. Reading from page 60, you say, when we say embodiment matters, therefore we go back to the meeting, or excuse me, I'm butchering it. When we say embodiment matters, therefore we have to go back to meeting as we did. One of the implications is that we value bodies that those environments are designed for more than the bodies that have historically been excluded by the physical contours of our practices. So for the church to truly value embodiment as important to its music and worship, it must be willing to ask how embodiment matters and whose bodies matter. I'm trying to find this past episode relevant to this, but share more about the quote, because I think that was such an important and powerful quote.
Yeah, I think one of the things I recognize, initially while I was doing this dissertation research, in kind of the literature that I was engaging with and conversations that I was hearing, but then more recently, I'll bring up an example from my ministry in Kansas City now, where there's a couple in my church, an elderly couple who are members of the church who found the church during COVID and have participated almost entirely online. And this is, they actually live fairly close to the church, but because of health challenges that they face, they just physically can't get to the building on a Sunday morning. It's not safe and practical for them to do so. So they worship with us online. And then we also have opportunities to have pastoral visits with them, for deacons to take them to doctor's appointments, for, these various ministry connections and relationships to happen. And their bodies matter to my congregation. And they are not just consumers of a product. We are putting out there on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
They're members of our church. They give to the church. They occasionally lead us in worship. That can look like recording a video of a testimony or a scripture reading or something that they share. And then that can be shared in, with the gathered body of believers. And we are made better because they are a part of us. And they're important to us. So I don't want to, say embodiment is so important to worship, therefore we got to do away with these, uses of technology that can include people whose experience of embodiment would otherwise exclude them from the church. I would rather say people's bodies matter, embodiment matters. Therefore, who are the people who are marginalized because of their experience of embodiment, and how can the church come alongside them and include them?
Yeah, good stuff. I was thinking of Andrew Draper, who co-authored a book, Disabling Leadership, a Practical Theology for the Broken Body of Christ, would recommend. I thought it was excellent.
That sounds great.
Yeah. I'm thinking too, and I wanted to, again, there's too many good questions to ask because your book is so rich here. Thinking about, it's kind of going backwards here, but again, I want to ask it on why corporate practices should shape relational postures. And I wanted to reference the quote here. The question of what makes worship corporate is not just whether practice is done in the presence of other people, but whether a practice shapes participants in a relational posture. So I'm thinking again, kind of stereotypically of the big kind of modern worship scene of dark lights and everybody's staring solely focused at the front of the room. I mean, this is a bit banging on my evangelical friends here, non-denom friends. Like, am I cherry picking there? Or is that an example of what you're trying to get at?
Well, potentially. So I think one of the major concerns I think people had early on when thinking about online worship was whether people would build meaningful connections and relationships while they're participating in church through this medium. And I agree, this is really important. And it's not a given that people will connect meaningfully through technology. But kind of in that example you're giving, I think it's also not a given that people will connect meaningfully in a church building. You can sneak in the back of a worship service, be in church, and then sneak out again without ever learning someone's name or having a conversation.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not a bad thing every Sunday. I'm an introvert myself, and when my social battery is empty, I'm perfectly happy to disappear. But in-person gatherings are not automatically welcoming and conducive to meaningful connections, and online interactions don't preclude those relationships from happening. So I think it's a matter of culture and of intentionality to build those connections. So when I think about, corporate practices shaping us in a relational posture, what I hope for my church's worship is things like people growing in their knowledge and trust of God, in loving others well, in sharing meals and working together for the good of their neighbors. None of those things are necessarily going to happen just because we sing together. And so there's more that goes into building that kind of community. And I think that can be done while we're using various technologies and when we're not. So I think, both can be true there.
First of all, I think, Michael, I'll say this, I think we're both going to have to go take an introvert walk after this, right? Probably.
Yeah. The on switch is definitely on right now.
Second of all, I'm thinking of, gosh, what am I thinking about? I came up with an introvert joke and then I forgot what I was going to say. This is it. Certainly in non-denominational evangelical settings, maybe this is too stereotypical. They think of worship as the music and the singing, right?
Sure.
In a more traditional or mainline context, worship tends to be understood as the entire service. Do you think that would help too, as if we just broaden our understanding of what worship is? Because then, if I think about the passing the peace or the greeting time as an act of worship, then it's more relational almost entirely, even if that is just hey, I'm going to comment on this video feed and comment back.
Yeah, I mean, worship is one of those words that you almost have to define in whatever conversation you're in. Right. Are you talking about just music? Are you talking about a worship service? Are you talking about, all of our life as a living sacrifice to God? And you can kind of take that full spectrum. I tend to agree, most of the time when I'm talking about worship, I'm referring to our gathering time together, including all these rituals and practices that we share. But it can be expanded to talk about other things as well. But yeah, I do think that expanding that a little bit beyond just music is helpful. And that's, part of the goal of the book as well. Like, while I do, I mean, my study was in the area of church music, so music is a big part of it, but it also goes beyond that. There's, it's worship more broadly. So I do think that may be helpful as we're thinking through those things.
Yeah. I want to shift gears here a little bit, talking about the role of the kind of classical evangelical worship leader, because that's one of my spaces that I work in now, is for a nonprofit that works with worship leaders called Green Room Leaders. And I feel like what you talk about in the book is like really the core problem that worship leaders are having to carry. So maybe to start, like, just talk about what you go back to again to this idea of unmediated experience of the divine, and kind of how that dynamic plays out with the worship leaders.
Yeah. So, I mean, I first kind of had felt my invitation into this question because of, again, these conversations that were popping up around online worship of people saying, oh, well, worship is supposed to be this unmediated encounter with God. And yet if you're engaging with church through technology, then that's mediated, and therefore it's no longer worship. So I think the logic there seemed to say something like worship needs to be direct, immediate encounter with the divine. So if there's mediation involved, it's not legitimate. And this didn't really ring true to me, because I perceive a lot of mediators and mediation involved in our worship practices. And I think this is true in evangelical or non-denominational spaces, but also broader than that. I mean, the scholars that I was referencing, like Monique Ingalls, Marcel Storenagel, Miranda Claver, and Joshua Bussman, they were all, referencing evangelical worship practices, and there's a lot to research there. So, and they also have kind of a wide-ranging influence on church culture, even outside of those kind of denominational or non-denominational bounds. So I think those ideas have, carry some water outside that space as well. But I would describe like those norms. I think they work something like, you have a worship service that is a fairly complicated high production value event with a worship leader who directs and models the congregation's expression of worship. And there are these hosts of media forms, projector screens or hymnals, electric lights and speaker systems, guitars or pianos or even pipe organs. And the music itself is a form of media also. And those all contribute to this moment. But then all of those media and the worship leader or minister who's acting as a mediator between God and the congregation are meant to kind of vanish so that the worshipers can have that unmediated worship experience. But I think if we're paying attention, all of these elements of media and technology, whether new technologies or old technologies like hymnals, architecture, all that, air conditioning, all of those play a role in facilitating that experience. So part of what I'm arguing in the book is that mediation doesn't need to be a dirty word for worship. Yeah. And I would say that all of our worship is mediated, and even our relationship with God is mediated through Christ. So I think we can take, a bit of an exhale to feel like we need to, conjure up this very intense experience that it requires us to ignore a lot of things happening around us. I think it's good for those things to not be occupying all of our attention. And I think that's part of what people experience with new technologies that makes it feel like they can't access that unmediated experience. If we're unfamiliar with the technology, if this was my first time on a video call, I would be scrambling, trying to figure out, how do I unmute myself? Where's the camera? And I wouldn't be able to have a conversation with you and connect human to human. So I think there's familiarity and facility with a particular technology is a part of what allows it to kind of fade into the background and allow connection to take place. So I think that's a lot of what's going on there.
Well, this whole concept, I think, is so interesting about this dynamic of the worship leader mediating, but then seemingly having to unmediate themselves, or you know. And I'm going to describe to you, because this, I was in this situation a couple weeks ago, and I I'd obviously read your book, so I was like, oh my goodness, this is what's happening. So I was at the small gathering of pastors, and it was more of an evangelical context, and there was a single worship leader up on stage leading worship. And what was crazy, I shouldn't say crazy, but again, seeing it in person, like with your kind of context in mind, like he would like, again, he was kind of in front of the microphone, but then like at points he would back off and stand to the side of the microphone.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, this is what he's doing. Like he's trying to mediate and then unmediate him, like get out of the way. And it was just so fascinating to see. And just seeing that, knowing what you're talking about here, like I just think like, I don't feel like pastors have this same kind of dynamic, this pressure. Is that fair?
I think so. And this is me kind of going off the cuff, but I think part of where that comes from is anxiety about performance. And I don't mean like performing well or poorly. I mean, worship leaders often carry this sense of, if I'm doing something that is considered a performance, then that is no longer worship, that is inappropriate, that is self-aggrandizing and not God-honoring. And we don't really think of in those same terms when we talk about preaching. We don't think of preachers as, sometimes they are self-aggrandizing, but we don't think about the act of preaching as performative and self-glorifying, when with music we often do. So I think there's that sense of, for worship to happen, it needs to not be about me, whereas I don't know that pastors and preachers feel that same burden in quite the same way. It may show up in different ways, but that's, one way that I see that showing up, where, and for me, like I again would just like to release that pressure of worry about this idea of performance, where, you're up there and you're performing music and you're doing it in a way that is hopefully shepherding your people into connection with God, into worship. And that's okay. And I don't begrudge anybody for, stepping aside from the microphone or wanting to direct attention away from themselves. I think that can be appropriate, that can be effective. But I think sometimes it does also come from this anxiety about, well, I'd better not be performing right now. I'd better not be a mediator right now. I need to disappear. So it's an interesting set of weird kind of subcultural norms we have.
Right. Because certainly, like when I saw it, I didn't get the sense that this person was like, embarrassed about performing. It was trying to convey like, this is not about me, this is about God, which again we would say is important and essential, right? But like you said, in preaching, like at least I haven't seen some preacher like wander off to the side of the
turn off my microphone for a bit, okay? I don't know.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that is interesting, and again, like this is where I'm a student from you and thinking about this, because again, like in my work with green room leaders, like this is part of the problem we're trying to solve, is like not just telling worship leaders like how to pluck the guitar better, but also kind of navigate this tension or dynamic they have of like feeling like it needs to be authentic, but also like their bosses are telling them that
authenticity, man.
Yeah, you better put on a good show, like, because if you're just, I mean, I'm not a musician, but if you're just screeching your way through the music, like that's not going to hack it either.
Right. Yeah.
And what is that? Yeah. Because again, I'm kind of getting in the weeds here, but you name this different dynamic between pastors and the musicians, the worship leaders. Like, generally speaking, like, obviously pastors, I think there's some leech they have. Like, if they just can't talk, like eventually that's going to run dry and they're going to get worn out, or folks are going to get worn out of hearing them. But to some extent, like, I mean, what passes as good preaching, I guess is what I'm trying to say, really changes and it's variable based on the context. Like there's some traditions where like it seems like all they do is just like talk through a passage of scripture for like an hour, and I think like this is not good preaching, and that's obviously my own bias and context. Whereas like when we think about a worship leader, like in the traditional evangelical sense, like there's pretty strict expectations of what that means to be a good worship leader, right?
Yeah, and so I think a large part of where that comes from is the contemporary Christian music industry, which
Right.
sets the norms
Right.
for what good worship music
Right.
sounds and looks like. So worship leaders, again, have this expectation placed on them that you're supposed to look and sound like Hillsong or Elevation or Bethel or whoever. And that's what being a worship leader means. So I think there's like a pretty standardized, like a pretty narrow model of this is what a worship leader looks like within that worship style, within that, whatever swath of churches are aspiring to that. So I think there are those norms that are communicated through that industry where, I mean, certainly there are expectations of what preachers should look and sound like and how they should behave in different church traditions. But I don't know that there's as much of kind of a machine or a cultural industry around, producing preachers that need to look and act and dress in a certain way. And I don't know. Again, there are different expressions of church music and worship than that as well. But I think that's where that comes from, is that kind of very present, very powerful industry and kind of those role models that are expected.
Right. And I mean, it does go back to kind of your point from before about religion or Christianity being somewhat of a buffet in that, like, because of the internet, people are, they're from all contexts of Christianity. They're watching Hillsong or Bethel, like they're listening to Stephen Furtick or what's his name, Osteen, and hopefully they're listening to some more like theologically dense folks.
Sure. And I'm sure those kind of pastors have an outsized impact on how preachers think they need to behave and act as well. So I'm not saying it's only musicians who feel that, but I think there's another level of, you don't go online and purchase Joel Osteen's or Stephen Furtick's sermons to preach in your church, but so many worship leaders are expected to play the same songs, try to do it as much like the studio recording as you can.
So practically speaking, like I've wondered, like, does it make sense for more churches to try to like simplify their musical worship because they can't replicate like the Hillsongs? Like, practically speaking, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think so, and this is kind of where I land also with online streams as well. Like, I for music and for streaming, I think the bar that many people think has been set is, how does the megachurch do it? We'd better do it like the megachurch. And I just don't think, I would say it's just not realistic for the vast majority of congregations to do that, either musically or in terms of, video and streaming and production value. And I don't think it needs to be. My own personal approach to worship leadership is, who are the people in my community? What are the gifts that are present? What music makes sense for us to do? Sometimes that is, something that's up on the CCLI charts, but oftentimes it's something different. And preparing music that makes sense for my people to be able to lead is kind of where I land with that. And, with technology as well, I come down to a people first approach. The question isn't, can we produce a stream like a megachurch to compete in the attention economy? The question I would say is, who are our people that we are wanting to connect with, that we are in relationship with, and what technologies, if any, are available to us that we can use effectively to minister with them?
And I guess this gets into the last question I want to ask you here. Ryan Burge has data out, at least if I understood it correctly, suggesting that the people who are watching are people who are already, connected. Certainly your book warns about shallow impact. Obviously, you've also talked about how just because someone's not in person doesn't mean they're necessarily shallow Christians, right? Like the example you gave of that couple. Like, what practical advice do you think about beyond just like not trying to go crazy and mirror the mega church? How would you advise churches, like theologically, thinking about like how much emphasis do we want to put on this? I mean, And let me just add context to this too. Like I'm thinking about even like in my youth of like so many Baptist churches, like they'd make sermon tapes. And like I remember early out of college, like this church I worked for had like a room full of past sermons.
Yeah. Yeah. And how many of those get listened to now, I wonder?
Yeah. So certainly this has been utilizing technology for people to experience what happens in the gathered worship experience has been a thing to some extent for many, many years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you reference Ryan Burge, and I've heard Ryan speak, and I really appreciate his research and the data that he shares with the church. So that kind of statistic, I think, is interesting, and churches should be aware of that. My impression is that a lot of churches perceived the growth of online church streams as an opportunity for outreach and for church growth.
Yeah.
Kind of that sense of, wow, we have, the world is our oyster. Our audience has ballooned now suddenly, and then 2 people watch your stream. So it's kind of a bit of a rude awakening there at times, because I think all of this is complicated by the realities of social media algorithms and pressures to increase production value, like we were talking about, trying to compete in, what shows up on people's feeds, and just those limited resources that almost every congregation, certainly the normative congregation, would have.
Yeah.
So I don't think stream services are a solution to declining religious demographics. But I do still think it can be a valuable point of connection, whether that's for potential visitors or for existing congregants. While I do think that, I think Ryan Burge is likely correct that most people watching church online are people who are already engaged with a church, I also know that a lot of people will watch a church's stream while they're trying to decide, do I want to go here?
Yeah.
So it is kind of a first impression way that people can get to know a little bit more about a church. I mean, and I think that's part of the reality moving forward, is that online connections with our communities will likely be the first foot in the door, whether that's a church website, whether that's a stream. And that's where the connection starts. And of course, we don't want it to end there. So the hope is that people can connect more deeply and in different ways. So I guess I would say, to churches, probably don't expect your stream to drive a whole lot of new church growth. But I also think it would be short-sighted for us to throw up our hands and say, well, if it's not doing that, why would we use any technology? So there again, I come back to the idea of maybe it is a stream, and I think a lot of churches are going to continue to have that. Maybe it's other things as well. I mean, and it doesn't always have to be new technology. When I was doing the research for the book, I came across this really interesting example of a community that was of people kind of out in this rural place where they had their church, but during COVID they couldn't meet. And they discovered that if they got on a landline telephone conference call together, they could sing hymns at the same time together. And it worked with that technology. That's not something that currently works very well with a Zoom meeting or a video, something like that, because of the lag inherent in the way those structures are built. I do think that lag will eventually be solved. I'm not sure at what point. I think it's possible. It's just not how those structures are currently built. But with an old technology like those landline telephones, they could make it work. So that was a meaningful thing for that community. Would that work for me? No, I don't even have a landline. There's the dog. Hello, dog. Hi. Anyway. Of course, I was going to be distracted by the dog.
I'm glad you found the dog more pleasant than I do.
But anyway, I think there are those opportunities for churches to use whatever technology makes sense for your community. And don't be afraid of trying something out. And also don't think that you need to use the brand new thing that just came out. Otherwise, you'll immediately fall into irrelevance. I don't think that's true of church. But the point is to be in community with and be accompanying people who are now living in a hybrid world of online and offline realities that are more and more integrated. That's just a fact of life now. It's how we move through the rest of our days. So, of course, that's going to have some impact on our faith. And then how do we live that out? What does discipleship look like in that hybrid space?
Okay, I'm keeping you long here, but I need to ask one more question, and you can feel free to be brief before we move on to closing questions. Do you think, do some churches, it's just okay for them to just be like, we can't do this, let's drop it?
Sure. I mean, I think so, yes. And honestly, I know of some church leaders and some church traditions that are actually intentionally saying, we are not going to engage in this space, whether because they just feel it's impractical or because they have some kind of theological opposition to it. They feel it's inappropriate for some reason or not what they want to be doing. And honestly, I'm happy for those churches to be in the world and be part of the broader body of Christ. I think we need both churches that are experimenting on the kind of embracing technology side and seeing what is possible, and churches who are not entering into that space and saying, let's stick with what we've received from our tradition and ways that we can embody that now. I think there are things to learn there also. So I'm supportive of that. It's probably not how, given my interest in my research, probably not what I'm going to do at my church, but, and where I stand theologically currently. But yeah, I'm totally fine with churches doing that. And that may be, an appropriate and a spirit-led decision for a particular church community.
Cool. Well, the book is The Hybrid Congregation, A Practical Theology of Worship for an Online Era. Michael, let's take a quick break and come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Dr. Michael Huerter. So thank you for your conversation and for your insights here. Some closing questions you're welcome to take as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what does that day look like for you?
Wow, what a day. Honestly, I have a lot of respect and appreciation for Pope Leo, and I appreciate his leadership and the posture he's modeling for the church in this moment. And I'm also aware that the global church is a huge institution, and I honestly don't even know what I could do or accomplish in one day. I'll just say it, I probably wouldn't be a very good choice for Pope. Having said that, I think I would want to find an opportunity, and I think this would require a lot of leaning on the leaders and people around me and just saying, okay, I just landed here. What are we doing? What's going on? But I would love to find an opportunity to work towards greater unity in the church around the central teachings of Jesus, like feeding the hungry, healing the sick, and caring for the marginalized. If I could just be a small part of more of that happening in the world, I think that would be a day well spent.
That would be a good day well spent. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
My first thought is Thomas Merton. He's a 20th century Trappist monk and mystic who wrote wonderful books. I found his theology really meaningful and formative, so it'd be incredible to meet and talk with him.
Absolutely. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Well, for better and for worse, I think we live in what some people would call interesting times.
Yeah.
There's so much going on, and there's a lot of change and uncertainty. I expect when it comes to the church, I expect history will remember how the church responded to the needs of vulnerable people caught up in that turmoil in society and technology and the government. I think all of that, I think that's what I expect we'll be looking back on, in the coming decades.
Yeah. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
My hope is that the future of Christianity is less concerned with control and more concerned with compassion. I hope we are less worried about theological differences and more involved in collaboration and caring for the people who are vulnerable. I hope we can treat God's creation with more care and respect. And I hope we can be less about maintaining our institutions and more about seeing the image of God in all people.
That's good. Okay, I feel like I need to ask you one more. That was such a good question. That was such a good answer, though. But I guess I feel like I need to ask you, as someone who researches worship and that's your scholarship, what do you envision what do you envision as like the next, I don't know, worship? What'll worship can't talk. What will a worship service look like in 20, 30, 40 years?
Oof.
And what I mean by that, like in the 1950s, like kind of mainline Protestantism was like the style of worship, and certainly like charismatic and worship singing was just creeping in some spaces. Now it seems like really like the kind of modern praise and worship scene has become like the style of worship.
Sure.
At least in America. Like, or do you think it's going to be too diverse to even have a dominant style?
Yeah, I mean, it may be that. I think one thing that I'm really curious about for the future of at least the church's worship through music is one thing I've noticed in conversations with people who are interested in kind of new expressions of church or reimagining church, deconstructing, reconstructing. It feels like there's not all that much interest in music per se. There's maybe this sense of, maybe music is just this, machine of cultural production and the industry. Maybe we don't want to have anything to do with music. I think there's something to be reclaimed and rediscovered in the music that has been a part of church movements for justice. I think about the civil rights movement, other movements around the world. When those kinds of movements of resistance and speaking against oppression happen, music is a part of that.
Yeah,
and I think we've a bit lost that or allowed that to be claimed, in other spaces in our culture currently. And I'm hopeful that something of that will reemerge. I don't know what that looks like. And this is also just me as a music minister kind of wrestling with what is the point of this music we make? What is the good in it? And how can we kindle that? So I think that's a hope that I have, a wonderment that I have. How can the music of the church reconnect with movements for justice and all that?
Oh, that's so good. I wish we had more time to talk about it. Because I'm thinking of certainly We Shall Overcome. This is hymn. What the other worship song that's really become, I can't think of the title, really become prominent, but it's not really connected to what, at least as I understand it, to what its kind of historical context in which it was written in. Really intriguing conversation. I need to let you go. I really appreciate the conversation. Share, if you would, how folks can connect with you or your website or any of that stuff.
Sure. You can find the book on InterVarsity Press Academics website. It's also on Amazon, probably other booksellers as well. You can get it in print or ebook or audiobook formats. So feel free to check that out. My church in Kansas City is Holmeswood Church. You can find us at holmeswood.org. So it was a pleasure talking with you, Loren. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate your time. We always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.